She said it 2 weeks before our wedding, while we were sitting in my living room, which I'd inherited from my grandmother 5 years ago. The papers were already filled out with just a signature line waiting for me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, staring at the deed transfer documents. Rebecca put her engagement ring on the coffee table between us. "It's simple. If you really love me, you'll prove it by putting the house in my name. Otherwise, we're done." We'd been together for 3 years and engaged for 8 months. The wedding was fully planned with 200 guests invited. "Rebecca, this house has been in my family for 60 years. Why would I sign it over to you?" She stood up and started pacing. "Because I need security. What if you leave me after we have kids? I'll have nothing. We didn't even have kids yet. That's what prenups and divorce laws are for," I said, but she shook her head. "Not good enough. I want the house now, before the wedding, as a show of faith." My best friend Jake was there helping us with wedding favors, and his jaw dropped. "Rebecca, that's insane. This house is worth $800,000. She turned on him immediately. "This doesn't concern you, Jake. This is between me and my future husband." Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Besides, I already told my family the house would be mine." I stood up then. "You told your family what?" She shrugged like it was nothing. "My dad needs collateral for his business loan. I said he could use our house." "Well, my house once you sign it over." Her father had started 4 businesses in 5 years, and they'd all failed. "Your dad wants to use my house as collateral?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Our house," she corrected. "Once we're married, everything is ours anyway. You're just making it official early." Jake pulled out his phone and started texting someone. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Who are you texting? This is private family business." But Jake kept typing. "My cousin is a real estate attorney. He's on his way." Rebecca's face went red. "We don't need lawyers. This is about trust. If you trusted me, you'd sign." That's when things got weird. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Daddy, he's refusing to sign. You need to come over." Within 10 minutes, her father, Harold, and her 2 brothers showed up. They walked into my house without knocking. "So you're the one breaking my little girl's heart," Harold said, standing too close to me. "I'm not breaking anyone's heart. I'm just not giving away my house," I said, backing up. Her brother Dennis laughed. "Give away? You're getting a wife in return. That's more than fair." The other brother, Carl, started looking around the room. "This place could be worth more if we knocked out some walls. Open concept sells better." They were already planning renovations. "Nobody is knocking out walls. This is my house," I said, but Harold stepped closer. "Not for long. Rebecca, honey, did you tell him about the other thing?" Rebecca smiled then, a mean smile I'd never seen before. "Oh, right. I'm pregnant." She pulled out a pregnancy test from her purse. 2 lines, positive. "So, unless you want your child to be homeless, you'll sign those papers." That's when my neighbor, Mrs. Cho, knocked and walked in. She looked upset. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. There's a moving truck outside and men are loading your furniture." We all ran to the window. Sure enough, there were movers taking my couch. "What the hell?" I ran outside with everyone following. The movers had paperwork. Rebecca Walsh hired us, said she's the owner now. She'd hired them before I'd even signed anything. "She's not the owner," I yelled, but they kept loading. Luis called the police while Harold tried to smooth things over. "Look, son, just sign the papers and this all goes away." But then Rebecca's phone rang. She answered, and her face went white. "What do you mean the loan was denied?" Harold grabbed her phone. "They found out about the house?" he said loudly. "You said it was a done deal." That's when everything clicked. They'd been planning to use my house as collateral before the loan even went through. Rebecca had told her father he could count on it, which meant she'd been working this scheme for weeks, maybe months. The moving truck wasn't some desperate last-minute idea. She'd scheduled it in advance, betting I'd cave under pressure from her whole family showing up. A car pulled up fast and Jake pointed. A guy in his 30s jumped out carrying a leather bag, and even from the driveway I could tell he meant business. He walked straight to the movers and started taking pictures with his phone, then turned to photograph the truck's license plate, the company name on the side, and every piece of furniture they'd loaded. Harold stepped toward him, but the guy held up one hand while still taking pictures with the other. He asked who authorized this move, and Harold said it was private family business. The guy pulled out a business card and handed it to Harold. "Michael Stevenson, real estate attorney." He said he was representing me now and that everyone present should know they were participating in attempted theft of property. Harold laughed and said his daughter owned the house. Michael asked for documentation, and Harold pointed at Rebecca. She fumbled with her purse, but Michael cut her off, saying he meant legal documentation like a deed or title transfer. Rebecca's face went red and she said the paperwork was finalized. Michael asked if she meant the unsigned documents inside my house that I refused to sign, which made Rebecca go quiet. He told Harold that showing up with a moving crew to take someone's property without legal ownership was textbook theft, and he was documenting everything for the police report and potential criminal charges. Carl stepped up and said Michael should mind his own business. Michael didn't move back an inch. He said threatening an attorney was a bad idea, and that harassment charges could be added to the growing list of problems they were facing. Dennis muttered something about lawyers being scum, but he backed up when Michael turned his phone camera toward him. Harold tried a different approach, saying this was all a misunderstanding between family. Michael said I wasn't family with any of them, and that attempted theft wasn't a misunderstanding. He asked the movers for their paperwork, and they handed over a work order with Rebecca's signature claiming ownership. Michael took pictures of every page. 2 police cars pulled up, and officers got out, and I felt my whole body relax knowing official help had arrived. The older officer asked who called, and Jake raised his hand. The officer looked at the moving truck and asked what was going on. Everyone started talking at once until the officer held up both hands and told us he'd take statements separately. He pointed at me and asked if this was my property. I said yes, and that I had the deed inside. He asked if I'd authorized anyone to move my belongings, and I said absolutely not. Michael stepped beside me and handed the officer his card, explaining he was my attorney and that the woman in question had attempted to coerce property transfer through fraud and family intimidation. The officer looked at Rebecca and asked for her identification. She handed over her license, and he asked if she owned this property. She said it was complicated. The officer said it was actually simple. Either she had legal ownership documentation or she didn't. Rebecca said we were engaged and getting married in 2 weeks. The officer asked again if she had legal ownership documentation, and Rebecca went quiet. The other officer was talking to the movers, who kept pointing at their paperwork and shaking their heads. The first officer asked me to explain what happened, and I walked him through the whole thing, from Rebecca demanding I sign over my house to her family showing up to pressure me, to discovering the moving truck outside. Michael added that he'd arrived to find active theft in progress, and that the pregnancy claim appeared to be another manipulation tactic. The officer asked Rebecca if she was pregnant, and she said yes. He asked if she'd seen a doctor to confirm it, and she said not yet. Michael quietly mentioned that pregnancy tests could be faked or borrowed, which made Rebecca's face go white. The officer asked Harold for his identification and asked what his role was in this situation. Harold said he was just supporting his daughter. The officer asked if he knew the house wasn't legally hers when he helped arrange the moving truck. Harold started to answer, but stopped himself. The officer wrote something in his notebook. The second officer came over and said the movers confirmed they were hired by Rebecca Walsh 3 days ago and that she'd signed documents claiming ownership of the property. The first officer asked Rebecca if she'd told the moving company she owned my house, and she said she was going to own it. The officer said that wasn't what he asked. Rebecca said she might have told them it was her house. The officer explained that hiring movers under false pretenses to take someone else's property was fraud and theft. Rebecca started crying and said I'd promised her the house. The officer looked at me and I shook my head. Michael said there was no written agreement and that verbal real estate transfers were legally void. The officer told the movers they'd been hired under fraudulent circumstances and needed to return everything to the house immediately. The head mover looked relieved and said they'd suspected something was wrong when the paperwork seemed off. They started unloading my couch, and I watched Rebecca's family stand on the sidewalk looking lost. Harold made a phone call, talking fast and low. Dennis kicked at the ground. Carl stared at his phone. Rebecca sat on the curb with her head in her hands. The officers finished taking statements, and the first one told me Michael said he'd already planned to file for a temporary order within the hour. The officer approved and said it was a smart move. He told Rebecca and her family they needed to leave my property immediately and not return. Harold tried to argue, but the officer cut him off, saying they could all be arrested for trespassing if they didn't leave now. They walked to their cars slowly, Harold still on his phone, and I watched them drive away. The movers finished unloading everything and apologized for the confusion. I told them it wasn't their fault and tipped them for their trouble, which seemed to surprise them. Michael stood with me on the driveway as the truck pulled away. He said we needed to move fast on the restraining order and that he'd have emergency paperwork filed before the courthouse closed. I asked how long that would take, and he said 2 hours maximum. He asked if I had somewhere safe to stay tonight in case Rebecca or her family tried to come back. I said I'd call my sister. Michael squeezed my shoulder and said I'd done everything right by not signing those papers and by calling for help immediately. He left to file the paperwork, and Jake stayed with me while I called Hannah. She answered, and I watched her face change. She was still standing there on the driveway. The phone was pressed to her ear. Harold was pacing behind her. Dennis and Carl were leaning against their car. Jake stood beside me. Mrs. Cho had gone back to her house. The movers were finishing up. Rebecca said something into the phone and hung up. She looked at Harold. He stopped pacing. She shook her head. He kicked the ground. Dennis asked what happened. Rebecca said the bank called about the loan. They wanted to verify the collateral. They'd found out the house wasn't actually hers yet. Harold started yelling at her. She yelled back. Carl tried to calm them down. Jake touched my arm. We went back inside. The house felt different now, like it wasn't really mine anymore, even though nothing had changed legally. I walked through the rooms. Everything was back where it belonged. The couch, the chairs, the coffee table. But I kept seeing Rebecca's family planning renovations, knocking out walls, using my house as collateral. I went upstairs to the bedroom. Rebecca's clothes were still in the closet. Her makeup was in the bathroom. Her books were on the nightstand. 3 years of her life mixed with mine. I opened the closet and started pulling her things out. Dresses, shirts, pants, shoes. I piled them on the bed. Jake came upstairs. He helped me carry armfuls of clothes downstairs. We put everything in garbage bags. Rebecca's phone charger, her laptop, her jewelry box, everything. That's when I found it. A folder in the back of her closet. Behind the winter coats she never wore. I opened it. The first page was a printout from a real estate website. My address. The estimated value. $800,000. The next page showed recent sales in the neighborhood. Comparable houses, their prices. Someone had highlighted the highest ones. Then there were notes. Handwritten. Rebecca's handwriting. I recognized it from birthday cards and grocery lists. The notes listed Harold's business loan requirements. How much he needed. What kind of collateral the bank wanted. There were dates. This went back 6 months. 6 months before she'd asked me to sign over the house. Before she'd even brought it up. Jake looked over my shoulder. He swore under his breath. I kept flipping pages. There were copies of my grandmother's obituary, articles about inheritance law, information about property transfers, a timeline, written in Rebecca's neat script, when we'd gotten engaged, when the wedding was planned, when she'd approach me about the house, when Harold would apply for the loan. It was all planned, every single step. My hands shook. I sat down on the floor. Jake sat beside me. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The woman I'd planned to marry had been researching how to steal my house for half a year. I thought about every conversation we'd had, every time she'd asked about my grandmother, about the house, about my family. She'd been gathering information, building her case, planning her move. I felt sick, actually sick. My stomach turned. I ran to the bathroom. Jake followed. I threw up. Everything from the last few hours came up. When I finished, Jake handed me a towel. I washed my face, looked in the mirror. The guy looking back at me looked tired, older somehow, like he'd aged years in one afternoon. We went back downstairs. Jake called Michael, told him about the folder. Michael said he was coming back over. He arrived 20 minutes later. I showed him everything. He photographed each page. He arranged them on the coffee table. The real estate printouts, the loan requirements, the timeline, the research about inheritance law. He looked at me. This was premeditation, clear and obvious. He pulled out his phone, called someone, asked them to come over, said it was important. 30 minutes later, another man showed up. Michael introduced him as Brendan, his law partner. Brendan specialized in fraud cases. He looked at the folder, studied each page, asked me questions. When did Rebecca move in? When did she get access to the house? When did I tell her about my grandmother? When did we get engaged? I answered everything. Brendan took notes. He looked at Michael. This was good. Really good. The folder showed clear planning. The moving company hired in advance. The family's coordinated pressure. The fake pregnancy test timed perfectly. This wasn't a relationship dispute. This was attempted theft, fraud, conspiracy. He thought the DA would be very interested. Cases like this didn't come along often. Everything was documented. The evidence was clear. Rebecca had made it too easy. Brendan said he'd contact the detective tomorrow, show him everything. This changed the case significantly. Michael agreed. He told me to keep the folder safe. Don't let Rebecca know I'd found it. Don't mention it to anyone except law enforcement. This was evidence now. Important evidence. They left around 7. Jake stayed. He ordered pizza. We sat in the living room eating, not talking much. My phone kept buzzing. Text messages, phone calls. I looked at the screen. Friends asking about the wedding, asking if everything was okay, asking what happened. I didn't answer. Didn't know what to say. How do you explain this? Jake's phone buzzed too. He looked at it, frowned, showed me the screen. It was a Facebook post. From Rebecca. I read it. My hands started shaking again. She was claiming I was abusive. that I'd threatened her, that she'd barely escaped, that her family had to rescue her belongings while I was being violent and controlling. The post had already been shared 15 times. Comments were piling up. People saying they were sorry, saying they'd had no idea, saying they were glad she got out safely. Jake scrolled down. There were more posts. Rebecca's friends sharing her story, adding their own comments, saying they'd always thought something was off about me, that I'd isolated her, that they were worried but hadn't known how to help. I couldn't believe it. None of it was true. Not one word. But people were believing it, sharing it, adding to it. Jake called Hannah. She answered on the first ring. He told her about the posts. She was already looking at them. She'd been tagged in several. She said she'd handle it. Not to worry. She'd call me back. She hung up. 10 minutes later, she called. She'd been going through Rebecca's social media, taking screenshots of everything. The posts, the comments, the shares. She was documenting it all. This was defamation, slander. Michael needed to see it. Jake agreed. He texted Michael, sent him screenshots. Michael responded immediately. This was bad but also helpful. It showed Rebecca's character, her willingness to lie, to manipulate, to destroy someone's reputation to cover her own crimes. He said, don't respond, don't engage, don't comment on any of it. That's what she wanted. Drama, a public fight, something she could twist and use against me. Stay silent for now. We'd address it properly later. Hannah came over. She brought her laptop, showed me everything Rebecca had posted. It was worse than I'd thought. She was claiming I'd forced her to sign a prenup that left her with nothing, that I'd threatened to kick her out if she didn't agree, that she'd been living in fear for months. None of it was real. We'd never even discussed a prenup. I'd never threatened her with anything. But the lies were spreading. People were believing them. Hannah said we needed to respond, not emotionally, not defensively, just facts. Simple, clear facts. Jake agreed. He pulled up a notes app on his phone, started typing. We worked together, crafting a statement. Short, factual, no drama, no accusations, just what happened. After an hour, we had something. Jake read it out loud. It explained that I'd discovered Rebecca attempting to fraudulently transfer my inherited family home to her name, that legal proceedings were underway, that I wouldn't be commenting further, that I asked for privacy during this difficult time. Hannah said it was good, professional, calm, not defensive, just truthful. I copied it into my own notes app, sent it to Michael, asked if it was okay to post. He called me back, read through it, made 2 small changes, removing anything that could be seen as accusatory, keeping it purely factual. He approved it, said post it now. The longer Rebecca's version was the only version out there, the more damage it would do. I posted it, took a deep breath, hit share. Within minutes, the comments started. Some people were confused, some were supportive, some were angry, some didn't know what to believe. But at least my side was out there now. At least people knew there were 2 versions of this story. My phone kept buzzing, friends reaching out privately, asking what really happened. I didn't answer most of them, didn't have the energy, but 3 messages stood out. 3 different friends, each saying something similar, that Rebecca had asked them strange questions, about my finances, about my grandmother's estate, about whether I had other family who might contest property ownership. The first was from Tom, a friend from college. He said Rebecca had asked him about inheritance law at a party 2 months ago, whether houses passed automatically to spouses. What happened if someone died without a will? He'd thought it was weird, but figured she was just curious. The second was from Maria. She worked in real estate. Rebecca had asked her about property values in my neighborhood, about how to get a house appraised, about what documents you needed to transfer ownership. Maria had offered to help with wedding house hunting, but Rebecca had said no, just gathering information. The third was from Xian, my old roommate. Rebecca had asked him if my grandmother had left anything else besides the house, if there was money, investments, other property. Xian said he'd told her he didn't know, that it seemed like a private question, that he'd felt uncomfortable. I showed the messages to Jake and Hannah. They looked at each other. This was a pattern. Rebecca hadn't just researched my house, she'd interviewed my friends, gathered intelligence, built a complete picture of my assets. Hannah said we needed to forward these to Michael. He needed to see how calculated this was, how long she'd been planning it. I sent him screenshots of all 3 conversations. He responded fast. This was helpful. Very helpful. It showed premeditation across months, not just the folder, but active investigation, questioning multiple people, building a comprehensive understanding of what I owned. The next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice asked if I was me. I said yes. He said his name was Clay Norton. He'd seen my Facebook post. He needed to talk to me. He'd dated Rebecca 2 years ago. She'd tried something similar with him. My heart started racing. I asked what he meant. He said he owned a small business, a coffee shop. Rebecca had dated him for 6 months, pushed hard for him to add her as a co-owner, said it would show he trusted her, that it would prove his commitment. He'd refused. She'd disappeared within a week, just stopped returning his calls, blocked him on everything. He'd thought he'd done something wrong. But now seeing my post, he understood. She'd been after his business. When he wouldn't give it to her, she'd moved on. Found a new target. Me. I asked if he'd be willing to talk to the detective, to give a statement. He said absolutely. He'd been carrying guilt about that relationship for 2 years, wondering what he'd done wrong. Now he knew it wasn't him. It was her. This was what she did. He wanted to help make sure she didn't do it to anyone else. I thanked him. Gave him the detective's contact information. Gave him Michael's number, too. He said he'd call them both today. He was sorry this happened to me. Glad I'd figured it out before the wedding, before it was too late. We hung up. I sat there staring at my phone. Rebecca had done this before. This wasn't a desperate plan born from her father's business problems. This was her method, her system. Find someone with assets, date them, push for ownership, disappear if they refuse. Move on to the next target. How many others had there been? How many people before Clay? How many after him before me? Jake came downstairs. I told him about the call. His face went dark. He said we needed to meet Clay. Hear his full story. I agreed. I texted Clay, asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. He said yes, today if possible. We met at a place downtown, not his coffee shop, somewhere neutral. Clay was tall, maybe 40, tired eyes. He shook my hand, ordered coffee. We sat in a corner booth. He told me everything. He'd met Rebecca at a business networking event. She'd been charming, interested in his work, supportive. They'd dated for 6 months. She'd moved fast, talking about the future, about marriage, about building something together. Then she'd started asking about the business, the finances, the property, the equipment. She'd suggested becoming a partner, said she had ideas for expansion, said she could help with marketing. All she needed was an ownership stake. He'd said no, wanted to keep business and personal life separate. She'd pushed harder, said it was about trust, about commitment, about showing he saw a future with her. He'd still refused. 2 days later, she was gone. Blocked his number, deleted him from social media, disappeared completely. He'd been confused, hurt, thought he'd somehow ruined everything. But now he understood. She hadn't wanted him. She'd wanted his business. When she couldn't get it, she'd moved on. He said her family had shown up at his coffee shop a week after she left. Harold and the 2 brothers. They'd sat at a table for 3 hours, staring at him, making him uncomfortable, never ordering anything, just watching. When he'd finally asked them to leave, Harold had said they were just checking out the place, seeing what their daughter had been interested in, seeing what he'd chosen over her. It was a threat, subtle but clear. Clay had been scared, but they'd never come back. I told him about the folder, the timeline, the research, the fake pregnancy, the moving truck. His face went pale. He said she'd told him she was pregnant too, right before she'd asked about the business partnership. He'd been excited, scared but excited. Then she was gone. He'd never known if it was real, never heard about a baby. Now he knew. It was fake, just another tool in her system, another way to manipulate, to pressure, to get what she wanted. We talked for 2 hours, comparing notes, finding patterns. The timeline was always the same. 6 months of dating, building trust, then the ask, the push for ownership, the pressure, the fake pregnancy if needed, the family showing up to intimidate. If all that failed, she disappeared, moved on, found someone new. Clay said he'd give a statement to the detective. He'd testify if needed. He wanted to help, wanted to make sure she faced consequences, wanted to prevent her from doing this to someone else. I thanked him. We exchanged numbers, promised to stay in touch. When I got home, the detective was calling. He'd spoken with Clay, taken his statement. This changed everything. It established a pattern, predatory financial behavior, multiple victims. This wasn't a relationship gone wrong. This was systematic fraud. The DA was now considering serious charges. Attempted grand theft, fraud, conspiracy. These carried real penalties, possibly jail time. I felt relieved, vindicated, but also sad. This woman I'd loved. This woman I'd planned to marry. She was a con artist, a predator. Everything between us had been calculated, planned, fake. The detective said Rebecca's new attorney had contacted Michael, wanted a meeting, wanted to resolve this amicably. Michael had refused, said this wasn't a misunderstanding, said attempted theft of an $800,000 property wasn't something you resolved over coffee, said his client wouldn't meet with anyone from their side without law enforcement present. The detective approved, said that was smart, said Rebecca's attorney was probably realizing how serious this was, how much evidence there was, how bad this looked. Hannah called. She'd found a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma from manipulative relationships. Her name was Melissa Price. Hannah had already called her, explained the situation. Melissa had an opening tomorrow. Hannah thought I should go. I agreed. I needed help processing this, understanding how I'd missed the signs, how I'd trusted someone so completely who'd been lying the entire time. The next day, I drove to Melissa's office. Small building downtown, comfortable waiting room. She came out to get me. Mid-40s, kind eyes, calm voice. We went to her office. I sat on a couch. She sat across from me, asked me to tell her what happened. I started talking. Everything spilled out. The house demand, the family showing up, the moving truck, the folder, the timeline, Clay's story, Rebecca's social media posts, the fake pregnancy, all of it. I talked for 30 minutes straight. When I finished, I was crying. Actually crying. Hadn't cried yet through all of this, but sitting there in that safe, quiet office telling the story to someone who wasn't involved, someone who was just listening. It broke something open. Melissa handed me tissues. Let me cry. Didn't try to fix it or minimize it. Just sat there, present. When I could talk again, she said something that helped. She said con artists are skilled at manipulation. That's their expertise. That being trusting isn't a character flaw. That I hadn't missed obvious signs. Rebecca had deliberately hidden them. That this wasn't my fault. That I'd responded appropriately once I knew the truth. That I'd protected myself. That I'd reached out for help. That I was doing everything right. She said healing would take time. That I'd need to process the betrayal, the loss, the violation of trust. That I might struggle to trust people again. That was normal. Expected. But with work, I could rebuild. I could learn to recognize red flags without becoming cynical. I could trust again. Carefully. Gradually. With appropriate boundaries. We scheduled another appointment for next week. I left feeling lighter somehow. Not fixed. Not okay. But less alone. Less broken. Like maybe I could get through this. I spent the next morning calling wedding vendors. The venue manager listened to my explanation and asked me to email copies of the police report and restraining order. 2 hours later, she called back saying their policy covered domestic violence situations and they'd refund my full deposit. The caterer did the same after seeing the documents. Then the photographer, the florist, the DJ. Each conversation made me feel grateful, but also strangely emotional because their kindness confirmed how serious this really was. These strangers understood the danger I'd been in better than I had while it was happening. Hannah showed up that afternoon with garbage bags and boxes. We went through my house room by room looking for anything Rebecca had left behind. In the guest bedroom closet, we found a spare key taped under a shelf. In the kitchen junk drawer, another key hidden inside an old flashlight. In the garage, a third key tucked behind a paint can. 3 extra copies she'd made and hidden without telling me. The violation hit hard knowing she'd planned multiple ways to access my home, even after I thought she was gone. Hannah changed all the locks again just to be safe, but I still felt unsafe in my own space. Mrs. Cho knocked on my door 2 days later looking worried. She'd seen Harold drive past my house twice that morning despite the restraining order. I called the police immediately, and they sent an officer to patrol the neighborhood. He drove by every few hours for the next 3 days. On the 4th day, the detective called to say Harold had been cited for violating the restraining order. The citation added to his growing legal problems and made me feel slightly more secure, knowing there were consequences for ignoring court orders. Michael filed a civil lawsuit the following week against Rebecca and Harold for attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and emotional distress. He explained this was separate from the criminal case. The civil suit could result in financial penalties that would compensate me for legal fees and all the damage they'd caused. He was realistic, though, saying collecting any judgment might be difficult, given Harold's string of failed businesses. Still, it felt good taking action instead of just reacting to their schemes. I ran into Dennis at the grocery store 3 weeks later. He approached me aggressively in the produce section, saying I was ruining his sister's life over nothing and I should be ashamed. I stayed calm and told him he was violating the restraining order that covered the whole family. Then I pulled out my phone and called the police right there while he stood frozen, realizing his mistake. He hurried away, leaving his shopping cart in the middle of the aisle. I waited until an officer arrived and gave a statement while other shoppers stared. The detective called the next day, saying Dennis's violation had been caught on the store's security cameras. They were charging him, which might finally convince the family to take the legal situation seriously. He also mentioned Rebecca had been uncooperative in interviews. She maintained that she believed the house was going to be hers and that I was lying about not promising it to her. Her version of events contradicted everything, including her own family's statements, which made her look worse. Jake and Hannah staged an intervention that weekend. They insisted I needed to do something fun instead of obsessing over legal documents every evening. We went to a baseball game and I actually enjoyed myself for a few hours. Jake told terrible jokes about the umpire's eyesight. We ate overpriced hot dogs and nachos. Hannah spilled soda on her shirt and laughed about it. For those few hours, I felt almost normal, like my life wasn't consumed by fraud investigations and restraining orders. Michael called the following Tuesday with an update. Harold's bank had filed a complaint with state regulators about his loan application because he'd submitted fraudulent collateral documentation. This created additional legal problems for Harold separate from what Rebecca did. The family's financial situation was apparently falling apart rapidly. Michael said Harold's business partners were distancing themselves from him now that his fraud was public record. Everything was catching up with them. A handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox that Thursday. It was from Rebecca's mother, who I'd only met twice during our relationship. She apologized for her family's behavior and said she had no idea what they were planning. She explained she was filing for divorce from Harold because this situation revealed problems in their marriage she'd been ignoring for years. She hoped I could find peace and healing. The letter surprised me because she seemed genuinely sorry, unlike her husband and children who still acted like victims. The DA's office scheduled a meeting with me 2 weeks later to discuss the criminal case. Brendan came with me to make sure I was protected. The prosecutor was a serious woman in her 50s who didn't waste time on small talk. She explained they were offering Rebecca a plea deal. Plead guilty to attempted fraud and conspiracy, accept probation and restitution, or go to trial where they'd pursue maximum penalties, including jail time. She laid out both options clearly and asked what outcome I wanted. I told the prosecutor I wanted whatever kept Rebecca from doing this to anyone else. She nodded and made notes on her legal pad. She explained that Clay's testimony about the previous scheme made everything stronger because it showed a pattern. Rebecca had done this before and would probably do it again if she got away with it. The prosecutor thought Rebecca would take the plea deal instead of going to trial where a jury would hear about her trying to steal my house. She said juries didn't like people who tried to con their way into other people's homes, especially family homes that had been passed down through generations. I asked what would happen if Rebecca refused the plea and wanted a trial instead. The prosecutor smiled slightly and said they had security camera footage from the moving truck, text messages between Rebecca and her father about the collateral scheme, and Clay's testimony about her previous attempt with him. She said it was one of the strongest fraud cases she'd seen in years because Rebecca had left such a clear trail of evidence. I felt relieved hearing that because part of me worried she might somehow talk her way out of consequences, like she'd talked her way into my life. Brendan added that the criminal case would help with our civil lawsuit because a guilty plea meant Rebecca couldn't deny what she did when we went after financial damages. The prosecutor said she'd contact Rebecca's attorney that afternoon with the formal plea offer, and we'd know within a few days whether Rebecca would accept it or gamble on a trial. Michael called me 3 days later while I was at work. Rebecca's attorney had contacted the DA's office that morning to accept the plea deal. I stepped outside into the parking lot to hear the details better. The terms included 2 years of probation, where she'd have to check in regularly with a probation officer and follow strict rules. She had to complete 500 hours of community service, which Michael said would take her months to finish. She also had to attend mandatory counseling sessions to address whatever made her think stealing someone's house was acceptable behavior. The restitution part meant she owed me $15,000 for all my legal fees, and she had to pay it back over the course of her probation. Michael explained that the restitution amount could go up if our civil case resulted in additional damages. The best part was that this would create a permanent criminal record that would show up whenever someone ran a background check on her. Future employers would see it. Future romantic partners who searched her name would find it, and anyone lending her money or renting her an apartment would know what she'd done. I asked Michael if $15,000 was enough, considering she'd tried to steal an $800,000 house. He said the criminal restitution only covered my direct legal costs from defending myself, but our civil lawsuit would go after additional damages for emotional distress and the cost of canceling the wedding. He reminded me that getting any money from Rebecca might be difficult given her family's financial problems, but having the judgment on record mattered more than actually collecting every dollar. The plea hearing happened 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. Brendan came with me because Michael was handling another case that morning. We sat in the courtroom waiting for Rebecca's case to be called, while the judge worked through other matters. I watched people plead guilty to drunk driving charges and shoplifting and drug possession. Then the clerk called Rebecca's case and she walked in with her attorney. She looked different somehow, smaller and less confident than I remembered. She wore a conservative blue dress and kept her eyes down, refusing to look at me even though I was sitting just a few rows behind the prosecutor's table. The judge asked her attorney if she understood the terms of the plea agreement. Her attorney confirmed that she did and that she was entering her plea voluntarily. Then the judge asked Rebecca directly if she understood what she was pleading guilty to. She had to state out loud that she'd attempted to fraudulently claim ownership of my house and had conspired with her family to pressure me into signing over the deed. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper when she said yes. The judge made her repeat it louder so the court reporter could hear properly. Hearing her admit what she'd done in an official legal proceeding felt surreal after weeks of her family claiming I was lying or overreacting. The judge asked if she understood the seriousness of attempting to steal someone's home through fraud and deception. Rebecca whispered yes again in a voice I barely recognized. It wasn't the confident, demanding voice that had told me to sign over my house or the relationship was over. The judge accepted her plea and imposed the sentence terms we'd already agreed to, then warned her that any violation of her probation would result in jail time. Rebecca nodded and signed the paperwork her attorney handed her. The whole hearing took less than 15 minutes, but I felt like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in weeks. Hannah came over that weekend with paint samples and decorating magazines. She said it was time to make my house feel like mine again, instead of the place where my relationship fell apart. We started with the living room where Rebecca were chosen neutral beige colors that she claimed would appeal to buyers if we ever sold. I picked a deep blue color I'd always liked, but Rebecca had vetoed as too bold. Hannah helped me move furniture away from the walls, and we spent Saturday afternoon painting. Mrs. Cho brought over sandwiches for lunch and stayed to help with the second coat. The physical work felt good, covering up Rebecca's choices with something I actually wanted. We replaced the generic artwork she'd hung with photos of my family and places I'd traveled before I met her. Hannah found throw pillows in colors that matched the new paint, and we rearranged the furniture in a way that felt more comfortable to me. By Sunday evening, the room looked completely different. It felt symbolic somehow, reclaiming my space and making it fully mine again without her influence everywhere I looked. I realized while we were working that I'd compromised on lots of small decisions during our relationship without even noticing I was doing it. Rebecca had opinions about everything from what kind of coffee maker to buy to which direction the couch should face, and I'd just gone along with most of it to avoid arguments. Now I was choosing things based purely on what I liked, and it felt surprisingly freeing to make decisions without considering what someone else would think. Clay called me the following Tuesday while I was making dinner. He wanted to check in and see how I was handling everything after the plea hearing. We ended up talking for over an hour about our experiences with Rebecca and how we were both working on trusting our instincts better. He said his therapist had helped him recognize that he'd ignored warning signs with Rebecca because he wanted the relationship to work, which was exactly what Melissa had been telling me. Clay mentioned he'd been dating someone new for a few months, and he'd told her about the Rebecca situation on their second date. He said he figured if she was going to run away scared, better to know early rather than invest more time and emotion. But she'd appreciated his honesty, and said it showed he was self-aware enough to learn from bad experiences. That gave me hope that eventually I'd be ready to date again too. Clay said his girlfriend had actually been impressed that he'd come forward to help a stranger avoid what he'd gone through, and that his willingness to testify said good things about his character. We made plans to get coffee sometime soon, because it felt good talking to someone who really understood what it was like to be targeted by Rebecca's schemes. He said the support group idea I'd mentioned sounded interesting, and maybe we could look into starting something for people who'd experienced financial abuse in relationships. My next therapy session with Melissa felt different from the previous ones. I told her about redecorating the living room and how good it felt to make the space mine again. She asked what else I'd compromised on during the relationship that I hadn't fully recognized at the time. I started listing things and realized the list was longer than I'd expected. Rebecca had gradually discouraged me from seeing certain friends, suggested I dress differently, criticized my hobbies as childish, and made me feel guilty about spending time with my family. Melissa helped me see that I'd ignored warning signs because I wanted the relationship to work, and because Rebecca was skilled at making her demands seem reasonable. She asked what patterns I needed to watch for in future relationships. I said people who push too hard too fast, who try to isolate me from friends and family, who show excessive interest in my finances, and who can't respect boundaries when I say no to something. Melissa wrote these down and said recognizing these patterns was crucial progress. She explained that people like Rebecca often test boundaries early to see what they can get away with, and when someone accepts small boundary violations, they escalate to bigger ones. I asked how I could trust my judgment again after missing so many red flags with Rebecca. Melissa said my judgment wasn't broken. I'd just been dealing with someone who was practiced at manipulation. She said the fact that I'd ultimately refused to sign over my house showed my instincts were working when it really mattered. Michael called with news about the civil lawsuit the following month. Rebecca's attorney had contacted him about settling out of court instead of going to trial. Rebecca agreed to pay $20,000 over 5 years for damages and legal fees beyond what the criminal restitution covered. Michael was realistic that I might not see all of it depending on Rebecca's financial situation, but having the judgment on record protected me legally. It established official documentation of what she'd done that would follow her for years. The settlement included terms that prohibited her from contacting me directly or indirectly, and if she violated that, I could take her back to court. Michael explained that $20,000 wasn't a huge amount considering what she'd tried to do, but collecting judgments from people without assets was difficult and expensive. He said this way we avoided years of litigation and got something in writing that confirmed her responsibility for the damage she'd caused. I signed the settlement agreement and felt another piece of this nightmare click into place. Between the criminal conviction and the civil judgment, there was now a permanent record of Rebecca's fraud attempt that anyone could find. Future romantic partners who did basic due diligence would discover what kind of person she really was. I started reaching out to friends I'd drifted away from during my relationship with Rebecca. Jake helped by organizing a group dinner at our favorite restaurant with people I hadn't seen much over the past year. Several of them mentioned they'd felt like Rebecca discouraged me from spending time with them. One friend said Rebecca had told him I was too busy with wedding planning to hang out, even though I'd never said that. Another said Rebecca had made subtle comments that made him feel unwelcome when he'd stopped by my house. I felt embarrassed that I hadn't seen what was happening at the time, but everyone was understanding and just happy to have me back in their lives more regularly. We made plans to do game nights like we used to before Rebecca convinced me those were immature. One friend admitted he'd tried to warn me that Rebecca seemed controlling, but I'd gotten defensive and he'd backed off rather than damage our friendship. I apologized for not listening and thanked him for trying. He said real friends stick around even when you make mistakes, and he was glad I'd figured things out before it was too late. Mrs. Cho knocked on my door one Saturday morning with an invitation to her grandson's birthday party the following weekend. She said she wanted me to meet more of the neighbors since I'd been keeping to myself too much lately. I went to the party feeling slightly awkward because I'd never talked to most of these people beyond polite waves. But they welcomed me warmly, and several shared their own stories of relationship difficulties and fresh starts. One couple had gone through a divorce after the husband's gambling addiction destroyed their finances. A woman around my age had escaped an abusive relationship and moved into the neighborhood to start over. An older man had lost his wife to cancer and was learning to live alone after 40 years of marriage. Everyone had experienced something difficult and come out the other side, which made me feel less alone and more connected to my community than I'd felt in years. Mrs. Cho's grandson was turning 6, and the party had that chaotic energy of young kids hopped up on cake and running around the backyard. Watching the simple joy of children playing made me realize how complicated I'd let my life become with Rebecca. Sometimes the best things were straightforward and honest, not manipulative schemes wrapped in declarations of love. 3 months after the initial incident, a check arrived in my mailbox from the court system. It was the first restitution payment from Rebecca, only $250, but seeing it arrive felt validating. It was official confirmation that what she'd done was wrong, and she was being held accountable, even if the consequences felt smaller than the crime. I deposited the check and then called Hannah to tell her. She said we should celebrate each small victory instead of focusing on how much was still unresolved. We went out for dinner at a nice restaurant and toasted to moving forward with my life. Hannah said she was proud of how I'd handled everything, from refusing to sign over my house in the first moment to following through with legal action instead of just letting it go. She admitted she'd worried I might cave to pressure from Rebecca's family or feel guilty about pursuing charges. But I'd stayed strong and protected myself, which took courage she hadn't been sure I had. Her words meant more than she probably realized because there had been moments when I'd questioned whether I was overreacting or being too harsh. Having my sister confirm that I'd done the right thing helped quiet those doubts. Hannah packed up her air mattress and extra clothes on a sunny Saturday morning about 4 months after everything started. She folded everything neatly and loaded it into her car while I made us coffee in the kitchen. We stood by her trunk and she gave me a long hug before getting in. She'd been staying with me on and off since the initial incident, sleeping in my guest room whenever I seemed like I needed company or when legal stuff got overwhelming. Now I was doing better, sleeping through most nights without waking up anxious, going to work without my mind wandering to worst-case scenarios every hour. We'd fallen into this routine over the past few weeks where she'd come over every Sunday and we'd cook something complicated together. Last week we'd made homemade pasta from scratch, which took 3 hours and made a huge mess but tasted amazing. The week before that we'd attempted beef Wellington, which didn't turn out quite right, but we ate it anyway while laughing about how the puff pastry looked more like regular pastry. She'd told me during that dinner that she was proud of how I'd handled everything, from refusing to sign over my house in that first moment to following through with all the legal action instead of just trying to forget it happened. I'd gotten emotional hearing her say that because there had been so many moments when I'd wondered if I was doing the right thing, if maybe I should have just let it all go and moved on quietly. Her support had kept me going when I wanted to give up on the whole process. We kept up our Sunday dinners even after she moved back to her own apartment, and it became my favorite part of every week. I had a therapy session with Melissa where we talked about whether I was ready to start dating again. She asked me specific questions about what I'd learned from the Rebecca situation and how I'd handle red flags if I saw them in the future. I told her I'd be honest with people early about what happened, because I didn't want to hide something that significant. She nodded and said that was healthy, that the right person would understand and appreciate my honesty instead of being scared off by it. I started using a dating app the next week and went on a few casual coffee dates with different women. Most of them were understanding when I explained what Rebecca had done, though one woman clearly wasn't interested in dealing with someone who'd been through legal drama, and that was fine. Another woman I met for dinner shared that she'd gone through something similar with a partner who'd tried to steal her identity to open credit cards and take out loans. We talked for hours about how it feels to have someone you trusted betray you in such a calculated way. She'd been in therapy for 2 years working through it and had some good advice about setting boundaries and trusting my instincts. We went on 3 more dates and stayed friends even though the romantic connection wasn't quite there for either of us. Just knowing someone else understood what I'd been through made me feel less alone. Jake called me one evening and asked if I wanted to grab dinner with him and someone he wanted me to meet. I showed up at the restaurant and he was there with a woman named Sarah, who he introduced as his girlfriend. They'd been dating for about 2 months and he explained he'd been hesitant to bring her around while I was dealing with all the Rebecca stuff. He didn't want to rub his happy relationship in my face while mine had exploded so dramatically. I told him I was genuinely happy for him and glad he felt comfortable including me now. Sarah was nice and easy to talk to, asking questions about my work and my house renovations without bringing up Rebecca at all, which I appreciated. Jake mentioned later when Sarah went to the bathroom that he'd told her the whole story so she'd understand why he'd been protective of his time with me over the past few months. We started doing double dates after that, going to movies or trying new restaurants, and it felt good to be part of normal social activities again instead of just focusing on legal problems and therapy sessions. The detective called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. He told me they were officially closing the criminal case because Rebecca had completed all the requirements of her plea deal so far. He said I'd handled everything exactly right by documenting everything thoroughly with photos and written records, and by not engaging directly with Rebecca's family when they'd tried to pressure me. The police department was actually going to use my case as a training example for other officers about how to handle domestic fraud situations. He explained that a lot of victims either don't report these crimes or they don't have good documentation, which makes it hard to prosecute. My detailed records and the security camera footage from Mrs. Cho had made their job much easier. Hearing that something positive might come from my nightmare experience made me feel a little better about everything I'd been through. At least other people might benefit from the lessons learned in my situation. I decided to refinance my house to get a better interest rate since rates had dropped and my credit was excellent. The refinancing process went smoothly, and I ended up saving about $400 a month on my mortgage payment. I used some of the equity to make improvements I'd been putting off for years. First, I had a professional security system installed with cameras at every entrance and motion sensors on all the windows. The security company rep was thorough and showed me how to monitor everything from my phone. Then I hired a contractor to update my kitchen with new countertops and appliances. My grandmother's kitchen had been functional but dated, and I'd always wanted to modernize it. I also converted one of the spare bedrooms into a proper home office with built-in shelving and a large desk. Making these changes helped the house feel more like mine and less like the place where my relationship had fallen apart. Every room I updated seemed to erase a little more of Rebecca's presence. I picked out paint colors I actually liked instead of the neutral tones she'd insisted on. I bought furniture that matched my style instead of compromising on things that would work for both of us. Rebecca's mother sent me an email out of nowhere about 6 months after the initial incident. She wrote that her divorce from Harold was final and she was moving to another state to live near her sister. She thanked me for not including her in any of the legal actions since she hadn't known what her family was planning. She said she hoped I'd find happiness with someone who deserved me, which was unexpectedly kind. I read the email several times trying to figure out if there was some hidden agenda, but it seemed genuinely apologetic. I didn't respond because I didn't know what to say, but reading her words helped me let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying toward her whole family. She was a victim of Harold's schemes too in her own way, married to him for 30 years while he dragged her through one failed business after another. I hoped she'd find some peace living near her sister away from all the chaos. Clay invited me to his wedding 8 months after we'd first met for coffee. The ceremony was small and personal at a park overlooking the water. He introduced me to several other people at the reception who'd survived financial abuse in relationships. One guy had an ex who'd taken out loans in his name. Another woman had a former partner who'd emptied their joint bank account and disappeared. We all started talking about our experiences and realized we had a lot in common beyond just the financial manipulation. We'd all struggled with trusting people again, with feeling stupid for not seeing the signs earlier, with rebuilding our lives after someone we loved betrayed us. Clay suggested we should meet regularly and keep in touch since it helped to talk to people who really understood. We started meeting once a month for dinner at different restaurants around the city. We'd share resources about protecting yourself legally, recommend therapists who specialized in trauma, and just support each other through the ongoing process of healing. What had been the worst experience of my life was turning into something that helped other people going through similar situations. That transformation felt meaningful in a way I hadn't expected. Melissa and I talked during one of our sessions about whether I still needed weekly therapy. I'd been seeing her for almost 9 months and had made significant progress. She pointed out that I'd processed the betrayal in healthy ways instead of letting it make me bitter or cynical. I'd rebuilt my support system by reconnecting with old friends and strengthening my relationship with Hannah. I'd established better boundaries and learned to recognize red flags I'd missed before. I was dating again with appropriate caution instead of either avoiding relationships completely or jumping in too fast. She suggested we transition to monthly check-ins instead of weekly sessions since I was doing so well. I felt proud hearing her list everything I'd accomplished because there had been times when I'd wondered if I'd ever feel normal again. We scheduled our next appointment for 4 weeks out, and I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. I met someone named Natalie at a friend's birthday party. We ended up talking for hours in the corner while everyone else played games and danced. She was funny and smart and easy to be around. We discovered we both loved hiking and trying new restaurants and old science fiction movies. She told me about her job as a teacher, and I told her about my work. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night and texted back and forth for the next few days. On our third date over dinner at an Italian place, I told her about the Rebecca situation. I explained the whole story from the deed transfer documents to the moving truck to the legal proceedings. She listened carefully without interrupting, and when I finished, she thanked me for trusting her with something so personal. She said she appreciated my honesty, and that what I'd been through sounded horrible, but also showed I had good boundaries and knew how to protect myself. Her reaction felt like a green flag I was now equipped to recognize. Someone who dismissed my experience or made it seem like no big deal would have been a warning sign. Someone who listened and validated what I'd been through while still wanting to keep getting to know me was exactly what I needed. Natalie and I kept dating, and she never pushed me faster than I was comfortable going. We took things slow, and I appreciated her patience. Sometimes I'd get anxious about trust or commitment, and she'd just listen and give me space to work through it. She met Hannah and Jake after we'd been dating for about 3 months. We all went out to dinner together, and I could tell they were trying to figure out if she was good for me. By the end of the night, both of them were smiling, and Hannah texted me later saying she really liked Natalie. Jake called the next day and said he approved, which made me laugh because I hadn't asked for his approval, but I was glad to have it anyway. Natalie got along with my friends naturally without trying too hard. She asked them questions about their lives and remembered details they'd mentioned in previous conversations. She fit into my life in a way that felt easy and right. I realized I was falling in love with her, which scared me a little after everything that had happened with Rebecca. But this felt completely different. Natalie respected my boundaries and valued my well-being. She never made me feel like I had to prove my love through grand gestures or giving up things that mattered to me. She just wanted to build something real together, at whatever pace felt right for both of us. I opened the envelope with Natalie sitting beside me on the couch. The letter came through Rebecca's attorney on thick paper with an official letterhead. I read the first paragraph where Rebecca wrote that therapy helped her understand how wrong her actions were. She apologized for trying to steal my house and for all the manipulation. The words sounded genuine but felt distant, like hearing about someone else's life. Natalie squeezed my hand while I read the second page where Rebecca explained she was working on herself and didn't expect forgiveness. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Natalie asked if I wanted to respond, and I shook my head. The apology was nice, but it didn't change anything or make me want contact with Rebecca. Natalie nodded and said that made complete sense. We threw the letter in the recycling bin and went to make dinner together. A year after everything started, Jake called to tell me he heard Harold's business declared bankruptcy. I asked how he knew, and he said one of his clients worked at the courthouse. Harold and his sons were working regular jobs now, according to Jake's source. Dennis was doing construction work, and Carl was managing a restaurant. Harold himself was selling insurance. I felt satisfied knowing there were real consequences for their actions. At the same time, I felt sad it took losing everything for them to stop running schemes. Maybe they learned something from hitting bottom. Maybe they were just waiting for the next opportunity. I didn't know, and I didn't need to know. Their lives weren't my problem anymore. 18 months after our first date, I planned something special for Natalie. I cleaned the living room where the whole nightmare with Rebecca had started. I bought flowers and candles and set them up around the room. Natalie came over after work and looked confused when she saw the setup. I took her hand and led her to the spot where Rebecca had put those deed transfer papers on the coffee table. I got down on one knee and pulled out the ring I'd been hiding for 2 weeks. I told Natalie she made me believe in love and partnership again. I asked her to marry me in the same room where my worst relationship ended because I wanted my grandmother's house to witness something beautiful. Natalie said yes before I finished talking. She pulled me up and we both started crying. Happy tears this time. We stood there holding each other while the candles flickered, and I felt grateful my life had led me to this moment. The house that caused so much trouble was now the place where my real future began. We planned a wedding completely different from what I'd organized with Rebecca. 50 guests instead of 200. A small restaurant instead of a big hotel ballroom. We focused on people who actually mattered to us, rather than trying to impress everyone we'd ever met. Hannah agreed to be my best person, and spent weeks helping us with details. Jake wrote a speech that had everyone laughing about the time I tried to cook Natalie dinner and set off the smoke alarm 3 times. Mrs. Cho caught the bouquet even though she insisted she wasn't trying. She told everyone she was 72 and wasn't looking for a man at her age. The whole room laughed and she did a little dance holding the flowers. The wedding felt right in a way my planned wedding with Rebecca never had. Everyone there genuinely cared about us. Nobody was counting the cost or judging the venue. We danced and ate good food and celebrated with people who wanted us to be happy. Natalie moved into the house after our honeymoon. We spent weekends redecorating together and making the space truly ours. She respected that it was my family home, but added her own touches. New curtains in the living room, different artwork on the walls, plants on every windowsill because she loved growing things. I loved seeing her personality reflected in our space alongside my own. The house stopped being just mine and became ours. Every room held memories of us building our life together. The kitchen where we cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings. The bedroom where we talked about our days before falling asleep. The living room where we watched movies and made plans for our future. Natalie belonged here, and the house felt complete with her in it. Clay called one morning to tell me his wife was pregnant. I congratulated him and felt happy they were starting a family. A few months later, he called again to ask if I would be the godfather. I said yes immediately. The honor felt meaningful because our friendship grew from shared trauma. We'd helped each other heal, and that created a bond I valued deeply. The baptism happened on a sunny Saturday at a small church. I held their daughter while the priest said prayers and thought about how something good came from my worst experience. Clay and I met because we both survived financial abuse. Now I was promising to help raise his child. Life moved in unexpected directions sometimes. 2 years after everything happened, I stopped at a coffee shop to grab a drink before work. Carl was standing in line ahead of me. He turned around and saw me, and his face went red. I thought he might leave, but instead he walked over after getting his coffee. He apologized awkwardly for his role in his family's scheme. He said he was in therapy working on understanding why he went along with his father's plans. I appreciated his accountability, even though I kept the conversation brief. I told him I hoped therapy helped him. He nodded and said he was trying to be a better person. I didn't offer forgiveness because he hadn't fully earned it yet. Maybe someday I would feel different, but not today. We said goodbye, and I watched him leave. He looked smaller than I remembered, less threatening. Just a guy trying to figure out his life like everyone else. Natalie and I talked about starting our own family one night while doing dishes. She asked if I was ready, and I realized I was. The fear that dominated my decisions after Rebecca was gone. I could imagine a future without constantly worrying about betrayal. We dried the dishes and moved to the couch to keep talking. We discussed what values we wanted to teach our children. Standing up for yourself when people try to take advantage. Choosing trustworthy people and recognizing red flags early. Recovering from setbacks with grace and strength. Building a life based on honesty and respect. Our kids would grow up seeing a healthy partnership between parents who genuinely loved each other. That felt important after everything I'd been through. The support group Clay and I started grew bigger than we expected. 20 regular members now came to our monthly meetings. We helped several people navigate financial abuse situations. We connected them with attorneys who understood these cases. We gave them space to process their trauma without judgment. Turning my worst experience into something that helped others felt redemptive. It gave purpose to pain that could have just made me bitter. People thanked us for creating the group and said it saved them from making terrible mistakes. Some were dealing with partners like Rebecca. Others had family members trying to steal from them. We shared resources and strategies and supported each other. The group became something I looked forward to each month. Hannah came over for dinner one Sunday and told me she was proud of who I became through this experience. Not despite it, but because of it. I asked what she meant, and she explained. I was more careful now, but not cynical. More boundaried, but not closed off. More aware of red flags while still believing in love and partnership with the right person. I'd taken something horrible and used it to grow instead of letting it destroy me. Her words made me emotional because she was right. I could have become bitter and suspicious of everyone. Instead, I learned to protect myself while staying open to good people like Natalie. I built a life I was proud of with a partner who respected me. The experience with Rebecca taught me what I wouldn't accept anymore. That knowledge made everything else possible. Our first anniversary fell on a Saturday in late spring. Natalie suggested we visit my grandmother's grave, and I agreed immediately. We drove 2 hours to the cemetery where 3 generations of my family were buried. The morning was clear and warm with birds singing in the trees around us. I brought flowers, and Natalie carried a blanket we spread on the grass near the headstone. I told her stories about my grandmother while we sat there together. How she taught me to cook her famous lasagna recipe when I was 12. How she never missed one of my baseball games even when her arthritis made walking painful. How she left me the house because she said I was the only one who understood what family legacy meant. Natalie listened quietly and held my hand while I talked. Then she said something that broke me open in the best way. She told me she wished she could thank my grandmother for giving me that house, because without it we never would have met. The gift that became the center of so much pain also led me to the woman I loved. I cried sitting there on that blanket. Happy tears that felt like healing. We stayed for another hour just being quiet together before driving home. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail with a check inside. The final restitution payment from Rebecca. $250 that completed her court-ordered financial obligation 3 years after everything happened. I stared at that check for a long time before depositing it at the bank. Then I took Natalie out to dinner at the nice Italian place downtown. We ordered wine and pasta and tiramisu for dessert. When our glasses were full, I raised mine and suggested we toast to closure. Natalie smiled and said we should toast to moving forward instead. To building our life together and honoring the lessons that made us stronger. We clinked glasses, and I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd been carrying finally loosened its grip. Rebecca would always be part of my history, but she wasn't my present or my future anymore. That belonged to Natalie, and the life we were creating together. Mrs. Cho stopped me one afternoon while I was checking the mail. She looked different somehow, and I realized she seemed tired. She told me she was moving to a retirement community across town. Her daughter thought it was time, and honestly she was ready for less maintenance and more activities with people her age. Then she asked if I would watch her house until it sold. Make sure the lawn got mowed and the mail didn't pile up. I told her of course I would help however she needed. She touched my arm then and said something I'll never forget. She told me she always knew I was a good person and that Rebecca never deserved me. Her validation meant everything because she witnessed the whole nightmare unfold. She saw the moving truck and Rebecca's family trying to steal my home. She called the situation what it was from the beginning, when I was still too shocked to process it. I thanked her for being such a good neighbor and friend. We hugged on the sidewalk and she patted my cheek like my grandmother used to do. 2 months later, on a random Tuesday evening, Natalie and I were sitting in our living room. The same room where Rebecca had demanded I sign over my house. Where her father and brothers had walked in without knocking. Where everything fell apart before it could get better. Natalie turned to me with a strange expression and told me she had something to say. My heart jumped because her tone was serious. Then she smiled and said she was pregnant. The joy hit me so hard I couldn't speak for a moment. I pulled her close and felt tears on my face again. This time they were tears of gratitude mixed with overwhelming happiness. I thought about how I'd protected my boundaries when Rebecca tried to manipulate me. How I'd trusted my instincts even when it meant losing my planned future. How I'd built a life with someone who truly loved and respected me. The house my grandmother left me was finally filled with the happiness and family she would have wanted for me. Everything she hoped for when she signed those papers 5 years ago. Natalie and I sat together in that living room holding each other and talking about our future. About the child we would raise in this house. About the values we would teach and the love we would share. The room that once held so much ugliness now held our greatest joy. I kissed Natalie and felt complete in a way I never had with Rebecca. This was real. This was right. This was the life I was meant to live.